this as everybody, or nearly so. So just a little bit of context at where you are. So last spring, came out here and essentially dealt with a problem slash passion of my own. So over the years, I have, for better or worse, a whole bunch of tree species. My primary interest is agroforestry species, so species with an edible component. So one way or another, I ended up with about 2,000 tree seedlings that I have no property to plant. So the Forest very graciously allowed me to set up this little agroforestry from seedlings from my own parents' backyard. So what the majority of this is, about an acre of the roughly 2 to 2.5 acre spot is sweet chestnuts. So who's ever encountered a sweet chestnut? No, maybe a little bit, right? Yeah, so chestnuts roasting on an open fire. I'll give a real quick background. This isn't the purpose of today. If you're not familiar with the chestnut in terms of America, so we did have a native to the United States and some of Canada chestnut, Castanea dentata. It is essentially functionally extinct from a pair of diseases that occurred in the early 1900s. In the span of about 50 years, roughly 1 out of 4 trees being a chestnut in the eastern half, east of the Mississippi for the most part, U.S. was wiped out by this pair of blights. It was a very, very massive mast species. The chestnuts were fairly small, more like an acorn than picture as a large roasting chestnut. And they were a huge part of the fire to this. So the song Chestnuts Roasting on an Open Fire. A couple of other things, sort of losing that food chain is theorized or hypothesized or postulated to have caused various extinctions, such as the passenger pigeon, because suddenly you have a huge amount less food available to a lot of these populations. The other thing, it has had very huge ramifications culturally, as well as socioeconomically for a lot of places. One of the other postulations is that West Virginia is as poor as it is because they lost what was essentially a huge free source of calories for them to fatten up livestock on. So that's one of the reasons for why some areas of that part of the country are still pretty economically depressed. So plant here is still chestnut, but not, at least not purely American chestnut. It is very difficult, bordering on impossible to find progeny of pure American chestnuts. They are out there, but they're also protected very carefully. So pretty much anywhere to the east of the Cascade Mountains, you have the pair of those two blight pressures that cause chestnuts to not succeed, at least the pure American chestnut, as well as the European chestnut. However, west of Cascade crests approximately, so Western Oregon, Western Washington, and parts of California, primarily in the north, you can have Castanea, the American chestnut, exist, and European chestnut as well. Both of those species are much more susceptible to the blight, but a pair of a very low population of chestnuts in the first place. We do not have a native Castanea chestnut in the western United States, as well as a differing climate. So the chestnut blights prefer a hot, wet, humid summer, which we have a very Mediterranean dry summer here. So the pairing of those things means that chestnut can survive here and do quite well. You'll often find them around suburban or urban areas. The chestnuts that have been brought over here persist. They spread on their own, they naturalize. However, the vast majority of them, I would hazard to say 99%, are not American in the sense that they're pure American. Funnily enough, we kind of didn't know what we had until we lost it. The whole breeding purpose of American chestnuts prior to these blights was getting a bigger nut. So again, it's just a small little nut. It's not quite as good for human consumption. So we immediately started crossing European chestnuts, which have a larger chestnut, as well as Asian chestnuts. There's 2 main Asian species of chestnut, the Japanese and the Chinese, with those Americans. And pioneers coming out here to the west primarily brought those out here. So most of the chestnuts that you'll find in that area that are successful are going to be mostly European. You're also going to find Chinese genetics, Japanese genetics, and usually a very minor component of dentata, the American native genetics. All of these different species have different, I'm talking too much about chestnuts, that's my favorite tree. All of these species have different good characteristics. So most of the culinary chestnuts, European, Chinese, Japanese, those tend to be a smaller tree. European can still be a big tree, but not the size of the trees here. but they have that bigger, easier eating, easier peeling, easier processing chestnut. Whereas American chestnuts, their native typical genetics, they can get 100 feet plus tall, which is pretty tall for the eastern United States. And they tend to grow much straighter, much faster. They're a much more successful timber species. So the saying used to be on the East Coast that chestnut would carry you from cradle to grave, because both your cradle and your coffin would be made out of American chestnut wood. There's various organizations, if you're interested, such as the American Chestnut Foundation, that are working on a couple of different methods. There's sort of two avenues to try to bring the American chestnut back. One is traditional back crossing. So they've hybridized and tried to go back and back and back, crossing with pure Americans to try to work some resistance into a mostly American genome. The other thing that they're trying is using genetic editing using CRISPR to just put that one gene in. There's various legal and ethical ramifications that have been bouncing around back and forth for decades. Suffice it to say, they have not figured out how to bring the American chestnut back yet. So what you're looking at here is, so again, roughly half of this space, so about an acre from roughly where it starts to drop off this direction, is almost all chestnuts, and it's going to be hybrid chestnuts. So expect a mix of European genetics, some Japanese and Chinese, and some American in there somewhere, but none of these are going to be pure of any one species. So the purpose of this was, one, to relieve the amount of potted plants I have to water in the summer, but two, to run a trial and sort of maybe start the process of selecting successful species here. These are never going to compete on a timber production stance with Douglas fir. They're probably never even going to compete on a timber production stance with alder or big leaf maple. However, you're getting other benefits along the way. So again, like I mentioned about the American chestnut, one of its major uses was as mast for feeding livestock. So there's a large, who's heard of Iberico ham, for instance? What makes it so fancy and special, do you know? Acorns, right. So those tree-fed livestock command a much higher price. They command essentially that terroir sort of extra price point, fanciness, desirability. There's definitely a lot of potential for that with chestnuts as well. Some pig farmers in particular feed chestnuts for those reasons. They're also perfectly fine for human consumption. There's a wide range of variability in there. So I would say about 50% of these came from a experimental orchard in Skagit County started by a man named Don Balzer. Did anyone ever meet Don Balzer or heard of him? So he was a USDA forestry science person in the Southwest. And upon retirement, he decided to come out here, and he just thought chestnuts were the bee's knees, basically. So he collected about 75 cultivars, so intentionally grown, high quality genetic strains, and planted about an acre of chestnuts in the Skagit Valley. And most of these are from the new owners there graciously letting me pick up genetics from those trees. The other place that the genetics here are from is a mixture of those trees that pioneers brought over in roughly the late 1800s through like the 1920s. So there are really large trees, especially in and around like old historic homes. So there's a couple of really old trees in Snohomish. There's others in Duval. Any of the sort of early settlement places that haven't been overly developed, you'll find at least a couple of chestnut trees. They do require a second tree to pollinate. So often you'll find one, but not enough around to cross-pollinate. There's also a lot in Thurston County in the Olympia area. There's a pair that I'm pretty sure is actually pure American at Burlington Edison High School up in Burlington, Skagit. There's also a couple of pairs down in the Olympia area that people suspect are American, but they hybridize so readily that it's really difficult for people to know for sure. With that being said, I think I will stop on chestnuts specifically, but if you want to talk chestnuts, yeah.
Know that there's a brewery in Portland makes gluten-free beer.
Yeah, so that is a good segue, actually. There is a lot of market for these alternative products. So chestnuts is one, gluten-free is a really good option. You can basically make everything from sweets. Marron glacis is a classic sweet that you make out of chestnuts. You can grind them into flour. You can use them. They're basically a little potato. What's special about chestnuts in particular in terms of agroforestry is their calories are carbohydrates. So when you take something like a walnut, their calories are primarily in the form of fats, which limits their uses. Chestnuts, again, are a carbohydrate. A good phrase is they're basically like brown rice on a tree. The other interesting thing about chestnuts is that in terms of the caloric output, when you have a mature producing stand of chestnuts, it produces roughly the same, almost the same calories per acre as corn. So it really is a high calorie producing crop in the right conditions. and you're not replanting, you're not tilling. So you get the various benefits of high calorie input agriculture, a specialty crop. You do get lumber as well. I would say, again, this is not lumber you're going to use for structural means or volume production. However, there is definitely desirability out there for chestnut wood, primarily due to its rarity. Yeah.
Also a nursery in Markham County that was planted on.
Yeah, I think, is that Skyline chestnuts? Right. Yeah.
One of them grew for several years and then it died off at the river.
Yep.
And started again. Just this year it grew 8 feet.
Yeah, so that's another desirable point on them. I will point it out again. So you can kind of see in one of the Vexar tubings, you see the one with the dead brown leaves. If you get a chance, go look at it, and it is sprouting from the roots. That's one of the best things about chestnuts specifically as well. It is very readily coppiced, so it stump sprouts just as readily as big leaf maple. So you can have a system here where you're cutting, allowing it to resprout as a standard. A coppice with standards is often what that's called, more of a European forestry style. And you have basically this continuous harvest without having to replant. In my opinion, that's something that we should at least look into, especially with more climate uncertainty. It may become harder and harder for us to reliably establish stands. I mentioned to a couple of people, so this was planted the other side of the road with Douglas fir last year, and only about 30% of the seedlings survived. I think we're probably all aware that it was kind of a weird year. So not just necessarily worse weather, but unpredictable weather, climate changes sort of thing might cause us to need to put more investment in making sure that we have a stand coming back effectively without having to replant or spray excessive herbicide, those sorts of things.
So you pick
So they're basically a little sea urchin. They are very, very sharp. In a lot of East Asian cultures, they'll come out with a long rod and whack them off the trees. They're generally not their best when you do that, but they will fall on the ground when they're ripe. You're going to have to race the deer and the chestnuts for them. That's one other potential avenue here. They're a really, really good mast crop if you want to improve the health of your deer, improve the health of your deer or elk for hunting, whatever your purpose is. But in about 15 years, this is going to be the hottest spot of public hunting land in Pack Forest. I promise you that. So they fall on the ground. They're generally encased in what we call a husk, which is really, really spiky. Has anyone seen a horse chestnut? So those are much more common around here. You cannot eat a horse chestnut. Squirrels can sometimes, but you know how it has that kind of husk around it, right? Or a conker is another name for them, or a buckeye is very similar. So horse chestnuts are copying, they're mimicking, trying to look like a regular chestnut. So those little weird, they're soft spikes on a horse chestnut. On a sweet chestnut, which is the general category of this genus, right? They will absolutely stab you and make you bleed. So generally, there's machinery that can do it. You can do it with tractors. There are smaller scale, like lawnmower, roughly size, or you can literally just take your boot, step on it, squish it, and it'll pop out the chestnut. Usually there's between 1 and 3 chestnuts per burr as well, and the size will vary a lot. There's a massive amount of genetic variability in chestnuts, especially when they hybridize. I think they do the exact same thing. I think they step on it, and a lot of the nuts will also fall free from the burr too. Yeah.
How do they do in an understory?
So it really depends on the genetics. So in general, in the East Asian genetics, if you have more Chinese or Japanese in your chestnut, those have been bred for a lot longer, literally about a millennia longer, specifically for eating. So they're more of an orchard tree. So generally, there's a lot of variability in Chinese trees, but the ones that you're likely to get genetic nuts off of and then hybridize with are orchard trees that are intentionally grown for food. So it might be a tree that's pruned and easily pruned and kept to maybe 10 or 15 feet tall. Those are not going to be as successful in an understory situation. They're more like an apple tree at this point with their genetics in terms of how they want to grow. Same with Japanese trees. If you go down this rabbit hole, you'll see a whole lot of variability. European chestnuts and American chestnut, if you can get those genetics, those are going to be much more successful in a forest environment. They can tolerate light shade down to medium shade. I wouldn't say, you're going to put them in your 440 trees per acre, 20-year-old stand and they're going to survive. But edges of forest lands, when you identify chestnuts that are producing, suddenly you'll start seeing seedlings popping up all over the place. Squirrels will move them and plant them, and one particular is blue jays will take them long distances as well. Yeah.
I can offer you as many seedlings planted by the squirrels of Chinese chestnuts.
Right. So yeah, you'll often see Chinese, and I would say here in the Northwest at least, so basically, in a very general sense, Chinese is going to do better with hotter weather. So if you hit California, there's a lot more of those Chinese genetics here. When you go north of maybe roughly the Willamette Valley, at that point, it's going to be mostly European genetics that are more successful. And again, they hybridize readily. So it could be these very complex, complicated hybrids. A lot of them are just mutts at this point. Yeah. The very best culinary chestnuts are considered to be part European and part Japanese, because you have a combination of good flavor and good size. Yeah. These were planted just last spring. So I haven't gone through, this is the first time I'm seeing them in maybe 6 months or so, but we're intending to replant this. It's a 10 by 20 foot spacing. The reason for that is that we weren't sure. This is sort of trying to split the difference in terms of, we want them to grow tall, straight. We want them to have some competition. We also want them to have the space to really fully develop and see what a chestnut tree, given as much site resource as it wants, will potentially do. Yeah.
Was the Vexar just like an additional control variable for you?
The deer and the rabbits and the rodents will absolutely, they love this. It is their salad bar sort of thing. So they are very, very sensitive to browse. I'd say on a par with like Western red cedar. Yeah, so that's the main reason for the Vexar. The other reason is I probably will be around here for another 3 years. Following that, I don't know if there's going to be another nut-obsessed person, but they are obviously not a species that we're familiar with. And I saw it being entirely possible that someone would come along and go, what are all these alder or weeds or whatever this is, and totally much unknown. So the Vexar is partially to help identify the intentionally planted trees. Any last quick things about chestnut before I move on? Do we have a few other species?
You mentioned that at Shiitake Valley, they had done some studies to make sure that when shiitakes get out into nature, that they're not going to be.
Yeah.
So have they done a similar thing related to that specific variety?
No. So I am confident that at least some, so I would call them successful non-native. I wouldn't call them invasive. Again, they're going to generally top out around 80 or maybe 100 feet. So in a successful, healthy, mature conifer forest around here, they're going to get outcompeted by far. However, again, in clearings, places like that, they are going to sort of exist and persist. I won't get too in-depth in this, but I think despite them not necessarily being native, they are an enrichment of the environment. I think they allow us to manage maybe more for mass species, maybe for ungulates, depending on whatever we're interested in. And that sort of relates to part of the motivation for this, not just chestnuts, but the other species, is to start identifying alternative species. So you guys are probably familiar with, if we're talking timber production, we really only have a handful of species here that we rely on. We rely really heavily on Douglas fir. Next best option is probably Western hemlock. Both of those are likely to be impacted by climate change. So starting to identify the options that we may have alternatively. I'm not saying that we're going to start planting all of the West Coast with chestnuts or black walnuts or anything like that. However, I think it potentially enriches it. I believe in diversifying your risk, for instance. And I think that the other nice thing about this is, especially for small landowners, it's a really long-term investment to grow timber, and you're really not seeing a payoff. You know, you work hard for 20, 40 years before you really see any money come back in the bank. Here, you might get to see some fun, some enrichment, some engagement with your family, with yourself, with the community within 5 or 10 years. Again, you're not going to get rich on chestnuts, just like you're not with shiitake stuff. However, it is a growing market. So that brings one last thing back, which is non-Americans. There's still a lot of culture in European cultures, in Asian cultures around the chestnut. We've kind of lost ours in the USA because our tree, again, essentially went extinct. But it was a big part of our culture. We still have songs we sing about it. I believe that we should try to bring it back, whether or not it's that pure American genetics. Chestnuts are a really cool, really adaptable, really widely applicable species.
I love your passion.
They're my favorite tree by far. They're really cool. You will probably, if you find any trees, you'll probably see me walking around. I knocked on someone's door just the other day in Duval, and he walked out with a shotgun, and I was like, I just want to pick nuts from your tree. I'm sorry. Another question?
So if you had something kind of like this that's going to be road edge, partial sun,
Mm-hmm.
you're looking for something that'll do okay understory to like ponderosa, dark fir. Would you think like filbert sort of thing? Or?
Yeah, so I chose this because, or I chose chestnut in this particular case for 2 reasons. This is a pretty harsh site for one thing, like you said, road edge, full sun kind of thing. Chestnut is European chestnut, which again, the majority of genetics here is going to be European, is a Mediterranean species. So this grows in, the dry hills in Spain sort of thing. So theoretically, again, on these harder sites and the ones that maybe are more susceptible to a failed seedling establishment. I think this is a good example of the type of site that you'd want to do chestnut on. Maybe as an alternative if you're worried about it. I wouldn't necessarily say all your site class 1s and 2s you should run out and replace with chestnut as soon as you possibly can. But these marginal sites, again, you're diversifying, you're doing something fun and interesting. Yeah, and so you can bring these to market. The main way that most people pick their chestnuts, though, is actually you pick. So basically you say, all right, it's $5 a pound, come out, pick up the chestnuts, bring them up to the front and you pay me. So it's once you get the trees established, very little pruning, if any, you have to do. Keep the ground reasonably clear depending on your arrangement. You know, it could be a nice grassy lawn underneath. You could leave it scrubby like this and the U pickers have to work a little harder. But it is not the type of crop where you're, you know, washing it thoroughly and all that unless you want it to be that kind of thing.
How long does it take to get nuts?
Roughly 10 years. You know, some might start producing as early as 5. If you have one of those trees that's grown, you know, 5 feet in a year kind of thing. Others can take longer than that. It really varies. So again, this is extremely genetically diverse as a population, which means you're going to have a good amount of bad and a good amount of good. All right, before any more chestnut related questions, which I am happy to talk about, I just want to point out that, so again, about half of this is chestnut. We also have a variety of species of walnuts over there. The main one that's going to be the most practical for you to consider is black walnut. So people are probably familiar with the high timber value of black walnut. It does take longer to get a crop off of. However, so let's say that instead of 2 40-year rotations of Douglas fir, you do 1 80-year rotation of black walnut, you're going to roughly double the amount of revenue you would get in that amount of time from that black walnut. However, it's a risk, it's a much longer time sink, that sort of thing, but it is very desirable and a very easy to sell wood if you have it. You know, it's very similar to chestnut in that what we have out here in the West Coast is really just scattered stuff that either squirrels planted or a pioneer planted, that sort of thing. So it's definitely something that is not exploited here on the West Coast. So definitely a worthwhile species to check out. Yeah. Yeah.
And it is spreading.
Yep.
They're spreading it everywhere.
Yeah. So just like chestnut, I would say not necessarily invasive. You could say it's native to the United States, definitely not to here. There is a California black walnut. It's generally different. But you will see them start to pop up. I think it's fun when stuff kind of, I would rather fight to keep something back than fight to keep it alive, is my perspective a little bit. That's sort of what we're checking out. This side is definitely, the side with the chestnuts is definitely the worst ground. Once you get over there, the topography is a little bit worse, but it's some nice deep sandy stuff, which is more like what black walnut typically would grow in the Midwest. Yeah. 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 Yeah, so the walnut family in general has what's called juglone, which is an allelopathic, basically a competitor reducing chemical, essentially. There's ways to control that. Black walnut is the most extreme, and it only affects certain species. So 2 in particular are tomatoes and apple trees. So you really don't want to plant anything in those families around a black walnut. They're not going to succeed. Other things will generally be okay. It partially also depends on the stress of the site. So that juglone really only kicks in if you have a really nice site, like a site class 1 or 2. There's enough resource there where they don't really feel the need to compete. But if you're on a droughty site, then that juglone will start to play more into effect. But it's not going to like kill it's not scorched earth, everything around it, but it will reduce. The other thing is, so like if you have one in your yard, sweeping up the nuts and the leaves can reduce the amount of juglone that you have. Yeah.
Is that other Solanaceae and other malice type things as well?
I would say apples and tomatoes are the quintessential examples, but the families in general would also be impacted. Yeah.
And the leaves from that are not good to put on a compost pile.
Yeah, neither. So if you get like free wood chips from Chip Drop, for instance, you want to avoid black walnut putting it in your garden because you don't know how those compounds are potentially going to be. Aside from the fact that it's a waste to chip a black walnut. So a couple of the other species. So there's a couple more walnut species. We also did Japanese walnut. We did butternut and English walnut. All of those are less desirable as timber species, but they're worth trying out. The other couple of species or few species we have here are pawpaw. Is anyone familiar with pawpaw? It's an East Coast species. It has a variety of quirks about it, but again, it is a very desirable crop, and you really can't find it anywhere outside of the East Coast where they have festivals for it and that sort of thing, but it is very tender skinned. It is North America's largest native fruit. And it is basically a really soft mango banana kind of thing. So really fun, really interesting, difficult to get pollinated because we don't have the natural native pollinators for pawpaw, but there's a few tricks you can do. They're actually pollinated by detritivores. So something people will often do is the clean way is take a paintbrush and go from brush to or flower to flower on your own. The other thing you can do is hang chicken wings in your tree when the flowers are going and bring in more of those beetles and things. But the fruit is a lot better than dealing with the pollination. The other thing is persimmon we've planted down here. Persimmon and pawpaw in particular I'm interested in because they wouldn't necessarily be the main species. They wouldn't be your main cover species, but they have a lot more potential to incorporate into an already existing Pacific Northwest forest because they're those medium and small sized trees. Yes. Yeah. So there is the Asian persimmon, which again is a lot more like an orchard tree. American persimmon is a smaller fruit, but again, maybe interesting in terms of that specialty crop. And I wouldn't say that you should only be interested in the species you planted here. These are ones that I've personally been successful propagating, and they're fun to try out. But American persimmon, I would say, is better at surviving in a forestry setting than a typical Asian persimmon. Yeah.
Observation. I
Yeah.
planted that, and it wasn't until the eastern gray squirrels came that anything ate them. Otherwise,
Right.
they just stay on the.
Yeah, and they are an interesting fruit in that they persist through winter a lot of the time if nothing comes along to eat them. And then the last, or two more species actually down there. Another one is ginkgo. So the ginkgo nut is a sort of exotic culinary thing. It's very prevalent in Chinese and Japanese culture. And again, if you're interested in targeting immigrant populations, for instance, there's definitely a market for that sort of thing. Ginkgo is one that you don't necessarily want to plant like in your backyard. It is also, the fruit surrounding the ginkgo nut is also called dog vomit fruit. Because it has that particular smell. However, again, the nuts inside are very desirable. A lot of the East Coast cities, ginkgo was planted because it's incredibly hardy, incredibly tolerant of pollution and terrible conditions and drought. It's just a really, really feisty kind of tree. And most of what they plant these days is a grafted male, so you don't have to deal with the fruit. But there still are those older trees out there. And I promise you, if you find a producing ginkgo, you will see usually Chinese grandmothers picking up the nuts in the fall. And then the final tree is catalpa. There's a couple of varieties of catalpa. Catalpa doesn't necessarily produce food, but it does have desirable qualities. It's a really good pollinator tree. The leaves of catalpa actually have what are called extrafloral nectaries, so it's really good for honeybees or other pollinators because it's a more consistent source of nectar. It's also a reasonably good timber tree. Again, nothing like our native timber species. However, catalpa is commonly used for something like a railroad tie. So there is a timber crop out there. The other thing is it's a really beautiful tree. Very desirable in those terms and very fast growing as well. So it might be another interesting addition people might like. Yeah, so it's a fun thing. I won't probably take us to the other site, but about 20 years ago, someone had similar ideas to this, not necessarily with the edible thing. And they planted a variety of other species down there. Basswood is one, basically non-native, but native to the US species. And those have been ticking along. So this may be something that doesn't provide valuable data in the short term, but if we want to be able to go out and measure, hey, how does a 20-year-old chestnut orchard go? We better plant it now. So I encourage you guys to, if you have a crazy idea like this, don't wait. If you have a little corner, plant something fun. It may be really useful data down the road someday. Yeah.
Consider sharing this data with people that have existing.
Yeah, so that orchard in Skagit, it's about coming up on 40 years old now, I think. So my intention is to core those trees and look at the growth over time. And try to correlate that because a lot of these are seedlings of those. However, it's really hard to find an actual block of chestnuts. They are out there primarily as sort of more of an orchard. So their spacing can be as much as 40 by 40 feet a lot of the time or even more. So that balance between, are you really just focusing on nut production or are you trying to also have that timber aspect as well is difficult to find. Great, perfect, awesome. Any other thoughts? Waste of time, cool, fun, interesting. Cool. So yeah, take a look around. Another thing about chestnut, they need acidic soil. So we actually are generally pretty good for that around here. But if you're interested in planting chestnuts, you at bare minimum need neutral soil, and acidic is better. Not extremely acidic, but reasonably acidic. Yeah, take a look at the trees. Feel free to walk this way. Also, just past the end of the Vexar, there's a redwood plantation where they planted a bunch of different clones of redwoods as a trial as well. Just along this road, I think they did coast redwood and also sequoia too.
In terms of like thinking of an agroforestry setup, what and like an alley crop situation,
Yeah.
what would you think would be a good pairing to put as like an understory crop?
I am partial to perennial things. I think they're also a little more practical in a forestry situation because this is going to take a lot of work to get to a point where you could do something like annual crops because of all the large woody detritus. And I'm not necessarily saying that we should start converting our forest land into something that's more like agriculture. However, I do think there's the potential for perennial crops like blueberries, raspberries, stuff where you do that initial investment, and around canopy closure anyways is when those would generally need to be refreshed and replaced. So, you know, that blueberry bush might provide for 10 or 20 years. At that point, your trees are really starting to take off. You can let them keep doing their thing or cut those out and sort of transition into that. In more generous, nice landscapes, you might be able to do something like grain. Other various types of annual crops would work well in those situations, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend them here. Yeah.
Seems to me like, you know, might be to touch on your point of like not trying to convert forest to agriculture, but thinking more of converting agriculture to forest is sort of what I think that the ideal goal of agroforestry is. You know, something like a windbreak maybe would be like a ripe area for emergent study, I guess, in this sense. You know, is there other aspects of that you could, because you don't, you know, we're sort of running up against the economic concerns of people trying to produce on a plantation scale. So
sort of in the traditional European model, thinking about like the countryside of France, that's exactly where the chestnuts and the fruit trees and the nut trees are, is along the edges of their fields. So there's definitely capacity for that, not just the edge of a field, but maybe the edge of a forest as well. So behind us is a high retention, distributed retention forest that I helped set up as an undergrad. I see no reason that you couldn't, you know, just plant a line of chestnuts along the edge of it and use that almost sort of a micro environment sort of thing along that road edge that you want to keep reasonably clear anyways. It's easier to access depending on how much harvesting you want to do, kind of thing. So yeah, all of those little unusable, or like if you have a little acre and a half somewhere that's a funky triangle between roads or somewhere, it's a great option for you to try something new and test something out. Not necessarily, again, taking over your best land necessarily though. But yeah, on your point of converting agriculture to forest, I think this is a huge potential for the Midwest, for instance, and a lot of our breadbasket crop, grain crop producing regions. This is something that we really should be checking out, again, especially in the cases where we think climate change may exacerbate establishment, not just of trees, but of annual crops as well.
I'll just add to that is a little bit different than forestry, but we're starting to put in more hedgerows on small properties and sort of tucking them into spaces. And you can do a lot with a hedgerow by incorporating edible plants, native and non-native edible plants. And they can just be a 3-foot swath, you know, as a privacy barrier or something. So they're a nice option for including extra food into a small property.
Absolutely.
Okay, pollinators and
Any other thoughts? Yeah.
Did you say they're low in oil content? Do they have oil content?
They do have fat, but it's not the primary source of, they're more like a potato, you could say, right?
You were talking about pawpaws?
Yeah.
Tell me more. I'm from Vermont originally.
Oh, that might be a little far north for pawpaws. Yeah, I would say that the home range of the pawpaw is like Virginia and West Virginia, maybe the Carolinas. But they're basically a chubby banana. They still have seeds in them, but they're very tropical tasting despite growing so far north. They're a relatively small tree, maybe, you know, up to about 30 feet. They tend to grow in forest edges. They can grow in deep shade, but if you're going to get fruit or significant fruit production, the more sun, the better. They're also a species where they can't actually tolerate full sun, at least at the early stages of their life. So sometimes you have to like plant them with shade and then remove that shade later. You can grow them, you know, like an apple orchard, but it's more difficult. But they're totally a specialty crop, unreliable in terms of natural pollination. Another thing where you need at least 2 for pollination.
Thicket growers too, I think.
Yeah, and they will sprout. They will sprout from their roots, ramicorns kind of thing. And so they'll create their own clonal thickets, kind of like an aspen. Yeah, but they're a really fun, neat, interesting tree. Yeah, I encourage you to plant them even just in your backyard for fun. But if you had, you know, let's say a 5-gallon bucket full of pawpaws, that's probably $100 there just because it's so difficult to find, impossible to find. And you could basically name your price because no one else is going to have it out here.
Christensen's nursery in Skagit County has pawpaws.
The trees, right? Yeah. And so the only place where you'll really find mature producing pawpaw trees out here is generally old hippie farms. You know, someone who got interested in it 40 years ago and planted the trees and gave them a shot.
got about 5 minutes still, so we can get back
Yeah,
down.
feel free to peruse around, and I think to get us out of here, probably once at a time, back up and then go down, kind of thing. We could try to go down and turn around, but there's lots of stuff in the way, so it'll take us our time to get out, but we'll get out. But yeah, feel free to peruse around. I guess one last thing would be specific to the butternuts. So there's a small planting of butternuts, just 25 of them down there. They are sort of on a path towards potentially functional extinction or very limited range left for two reasons. One, there's a butternut canker. So they're sort of going down the same route that American chestnut did. The other thing is hybridization. So the Japanese walnut hybridizes readily with butternut. So just like it's impossible essentially to find pure American chestnuts, it's very difficult to find pure butternuts. So establishing those genetic banks is important, especially outside of their natural range. So we're isolated from a lot of that here. And theoretically, this could be the type of thing where 40 years down the road, if they need genetics from that particular species, this could be worthwhile. Yeah. Butternut. So butternut is a species of walnut. Yeah. It's also called white walnut. Yeah. Cool. I have one small thing for anybody who's interested. I would have liked to bring chestnuts for everybody, but it's just a couple weeks too early. However, I do have. No.
Oh, it's not.
It's possible they're just. There's bitternut hickory. There's also pig nut.
Is this a papa?
These are black walnuts. Yeah, so if you want to give growing them a shot, here, I'll just say it real quick to everybody. Yeah, so if anybody wants to give it a shot, these are black walnuts from a very nice timber type species that grows on my neighbor's property. Two things, the husks are still on these. Once you take this husk off, it will stain you like nothing else and you will not get it off your fingers for weeks. They actually make stain out of walnut husks, specifically black walnut husk is really good for it. The second thing is if you try to plant this, the squirrel in your yard will find it and will eat it. So this is something that for the first year, you should grow like in a sunny window, something like that. Yeah, but I've got a handful of them here if anyone wants to try. You could do that, but probably the squirrel will find it and dig it up and eat it. But if you just I would take the husk off, the nut will be inside there. Place it at least about an inch deep in potting soil. They do have a taproot, so if you can get a deep pot, it's better. It's not essential. And then the following year, once you've taken the nut off, you can plant it pretty much wherever. Full sun, part shade, not super duper deep shade. They will tolerate wet feet, but not, like a pond. Right.
So best to take that.
Take the husk off, yeah. But be aware, once you take this husk off, it won't seem like it at first, but it will stain the Jesus out of your hands. It eventually turns kind of brownish purple. Yeah. It's not bad or anything. Also, give it a smell. Some people really like the smell. Some people can't stand it. Here. Yeah, anybody who wants one?
I have one tree, but I need two.
Here, take two just in case. Make sure. Just in case. They literally fall on the ground. So.
What do you think, Margaret?
Thank you guys. Anybody else?
Good,
I'm just gonna huck them in the woods if you don't take them.
The organizer.
Yeah, take a couple if you're interested.
Great.
It's a good show.
Thank you guys.
And
Thank you.
we're going to shut off here.
Okay.
Right.
Call it a day.
Anybody else interested?